So we want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva and Peach Nation peoples and their neighbors from north to south, the Chumash, Tataviam, Itanimuk, Serrano, Cahuilla, Kayam-Kuicham, Ahashaman, Ipai-Tipai, the Kumeyaay, and the Quechan peoples, whose ancestors ruled the region we now call Southern California for at least 9,000 years. Indigenous stewardship and rightful claims to these lands have never been voluntarily relinquished nor legally extinguished. We pay respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain caretakers and advocates of these lands, river systems, and the waters and islands of the Santa Barbara Channel. For a more detailed land acknowledgement authored by the USC Van Hunnick History Department, we invite you to visit their website. And my colleague Maya will put that link into the chat. We'd love to know where you're watching from for those of you joining us online, so feel free to let us know in the chat. And if you want to know what Indigenous territory you're on, Maya will also be posting a link to where you can investigate that. So my name is Martha Stroud. I'm the Associate Director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research. And I'm so delighted to welcome all of you here in person and those of you joining us online this lecture. We are kicking off a very busy season of Center for Advanced Genocide Research lectures. I think we have 5 events in the next 4 weeks. So we hope to see you over and over again. And I'm sure Maya will put a link to the upcoming events in the chat as well. Just a couple of notes about the Zoom protocols. First of all, for everyone in the room, if you could make sure your phones are on mute. And for those of you joining us on Zoom, right now you're viewing a side-by-side view of the slides and the speaker, and you can make either window larger or smaller by dragging the dividing line between the 2 units, left or right. I probably don't need to explain that after all these years of Zoom lectures. We will have time for questions and discussion following Faye's lecture, so we invite and encourage your questions here and also online. Online, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom of the Zoom window, and we'll try to get to as many questions as time allows. Apologies in advance if we don't ask your question. This is being recorded. We are going to make the recording widely available, and we're going to share the chat and all the questions that are asked in the Q&A with Faye following the lecture. We do ask you to be respectful in the chat, and thank you for that. So now, to introduce today's lecture and our speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce the founding director of the USC Dornsife Center for Advanced Genocide Research, Chappell Guerin Chair in Jewish Studies and Professor of History, Wolf Brunner.
Thank you, Martha, and welcome everybody here in person and on Zoom. And thanks to Martha, Maya, and Charlotte for preparing this event, as always. So I want to introduce our last summer fellow, Faye Yan Zhang, is a PhD student in Media Arts and Practice here at USC. It is a School of Cinematic Arts. She earned her BA, her Bachelor in English and Visual Environmental Studies at Harvard University, and moved then to Peking University to get a Master in Chinese Law and Society, and then later also got a Master in Visual Anthropology at the University of Manchester as a Fulbright scholar. When she was in Manchester, she trained in filmmaking and anthropological research methods at the Manchester Center for Visual Anthropology. Zhang is a visual artist and ethnographic filmmaker. She's working in video, comics, and animation, and her work often circumnavigates themes that arise from and intersects with China's turbulent periods of social reform, from the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949 to the country's present day politics. Zhang has published many works of poetry, non-fiction, and humor. Her art and films have been widely published and exhibited. She published, for example, in the Harvard Lampoon, the Harvard Advocate, the Harvard Medieval Studies Journal, and also in literary journals and magazines like the Harper Palette, the Marathon Literary Review, and American Coordinator. Her art and her films have been exhibited or have been published in the City Week in Beijing, the Southampton Review, and the Black Warrior Review. And her films have been exhibited or screened at the Harvard Folk Art Museum, the Carpenter Center for Visual Arts, and the Asian American Writers Workshop. So please give Faye Yan Zhang a very warm hand and welcome this interesting presentation.
Thank you for that introduction. And thank you everyone for being here. I'm so glad to see you here. Before beginning the talk, I do want to give warning that I will be talking about difficult topics related to the Nanjing Massacre. Heavy going during a lunch break, so feel free to take a break if needed. Additionally, the interviews referenced will be in first name, last name order as they are in the Visual History Archive. I'm very grateful to Dr. Martha Stroud, Wolf Bruner, and Maya Takumi-Worrell of the USC Center for Advanced Genocide Research. They keep the Visual History Archive going and have supported the work of countless researchers. I thank the hardworking interviewers and videographers of the collection, such as Yanming Lu, Gong Cheng, Bang Cheng, and others. And above all, I thank the survivors and their family members who have generously shared their memories. When I sat down in front of the computer at the Visual History Archive last summer, it was difficult to know where to begin. I am Chinese American. My family immigrated to the US when I was 3 years old. That's me looking very skeptical. Like many American kids, I learned about the Nanjing Massacre at school from the pages of a history textbook. My parents didn't talk about it, not because they're particularly squeamish or conservative. It's just that how do you even articulate words like genocide to your children? What would be the appropriate context to bring it up? During a family dinner, it can be a mood killer to say, okay, kids, today we're going to talk about the Nanjing Massacre. How do you vocalize such things, even when they have happened to someone you know, or it's happening to you at that very moment? And how do you deal with the aftermath, not just what had happened, but how to talk about it? I can imagine that the parents in Nanjing in 1937 did not talk about the war to their children, especially to the girl children, who, as the interviews showed, often had no formal education. But surely the war permeated their lives, even if they had no clear recollection of being told about it. War was in the air they breathed. Inevitably, the Japanese soldiers were advancing towards Nanjing, killing everyone along the way. But the average person with no wealth or power to shield them was unprepared for what would happen until it happened. Faye Yan Zhang, born 1923. Back then, we had no idea of what a country was. I was a teenager in 1937. We lived in Susua village. At that time, we knew nothing about what the war was. I was playing outside when a policeman told me to quickly go home. No one in our family talked about the war or anything. Only after people were coming day and night did we realize that the Japanese were warring with us. We didn't know why. Back then, girls didn't talk much. We didn't ask anything. We just cared about our own safety. We were neither competent nor literary. We didn't expect to be able to do anything. Imagine you are in Nanjing in 1937. It is a cold December day. The Japanese army advances. Chinese forces have withdrawn, leaving the city with little defense. Information trickled down to the girls who are now the old women being interviewed. Shoah Wu, born 1933. When we were having lunch, we heard cannon. Many people stayed at home instead of running for their lives. Shoah Ma, born 1922. I was walking with my mother when the Japanese came. I said, "Ma, the Japanese are coming. We have to make a detour." There were so many dead bodies in the train station, we could hardly go down the stairs. There was a mass grave and the Japanese set fire to the mountain. Wen Yingchun, born 1936. Because we were ordinary people, we did not know that we could run towards Chongqing. When the Japanese came, we took a few things. My father brought a foot bath because my mother was about to give birth. Wen Yingren, born 1923. My uncle heard there was a refugee zone. We followed the crowd. Earlier, I told you that I learned about the Nanjing Massacre at school, but truth be told, I don't remember exactly when I learned about it. And because I don't remember when I learned about it, I feel like I've known about it all my life. My grandmother on my mom's side had always lived an hour's drive from Nanjing. To my knowledge, she did not witness the massacre, though surely the Japanese occupation impacted her life. She rarely talks about it either. That period of her life is too intimate and full of strange happenings, but that's a story for another time. I remember going to a museum of history in Beijing over a decade ago. By chance, there was an exhibition about the Nanjing Massacre. In the modern day, Chinese museums, when reminiscing about that period, tend towards grotesqueness. Their affect is of high tragedy. They evoke a mess of tangled feelings, pity and horror, as well as admiration for the endurance of the victims. I remember the exhibition hall was hung with dimly lit paintings echoing the social realist style, mostly masses of writhing bodies, fire and blood, distraught women and children, perhaps based on real photographs. Whether they are good paintings, I don't know. But the idea of goodness or badness seems irrelevant. What is important to me is that they represent one way of processing trauma, the way that the Chinese government has chosen, and perhaps many Chinese people too. To go over the atrocities committed by the Japanese army is difficult and beyond the scope of this talk. I will say that the massacre was systematic. To comprehensively subjugate northern China, the Imperial Japanese government followed the 3-all policy: loot all, kill all, burn all. When the Imperial Army descended on Nanjing, they were primed by nationalist and military indoctrination to commit acts beyond mere killing. In Nanjing, there was mass slaughter of soldiers and civilians lured to surrender, brutal, widespread, and indiscriminate rape and murder of the rape victims, and diabolical means of torture derived seemingly for amusement. In other words, the worst acts that one person can commit to another person. In the end, by many accounts, the number of human bodies, an estimated 300,000, overwhelmed the ground needed for burying them. The streets were covered in bodies. The bodies were dumped in the Yangtze River, where they floated away. These acts are well documented by other research, and I won't belabor them here. But one memory that sticks in my mind is from Wen Yingchun's interview. She was 3 years old during the massacre, and later in life she became a teacher and a member of the Communist Party. As her family was fleeing their home on a cart, her father stood up to look out, was immediately shot by one bullet, and died. The randomness of the encounter is what affects me. Her father was not singled out for torture or forced labor. He simply stood up to look out, and he died. Reconciling the present-day Wen Yingchun, a neat, articulate woman, with the little girl who stood next to her father as he was shot is difficult. But the reality of the massacre was that fathers were killed randomly, and daughters too. Genocide is tragic, so too are its afterlives. Official memorialization of the Nanjing Massacre in China actually emerged only in the 1980s, 40 years after the events. Although newspapers reported on the events at the time, after the Japanese surrender in 1945, the Communist Party and the Nationalist Party were soon entangled in civil war, from which the Communist Party emerged victorious and embarked on its project of state building. During the ideological fervor of those years, the Nanjing Massacre did not align with the party's revolutionary discourse of class struggle. Moreover, it was an impediment to establishing diplomatic relationships with Japan, and discussing sexual violence was taboo then, and it remains a sensitive topic in China now. Suyin Li says, during the Cultural Revolution, when there was class struggle, we did not dare to talk about such things. But when the memorialization project began, it began in earnest. The Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall and nearby sites were opened in 1985. Today, the heritage of the Nanjing Massacre, like all heritages, serves the purpose. Many scholars argue that the Nanjing Massacre is used by the Communist Party as a historical touchstone, a tool that can be used to guide Sino-Japanese relations and fan sentiments of nationalism and support for the Communist Party when its legitimacy is called into question. Many of the survivors interviewed cannot forgive Japan or Japanese people, and after what they experienced, I do not expect them to. But in the interviews, I found that their emotions of fear and hatred did not exist in a vacuum, but were often connected to Chinese patriotism, specifically to party patriotism. Shoyi Ma. Whenever the TV turns on and shows a Japanese person, I'm filled with hatred. When I arrived at the memorial hall, there was a Japanese man who bowed down and dragged his clogs on the ground. Even then, I felt hatred. Shizuzu, born 1920. In China, it is not allowed to kill the Japanese. I want to kill them. Here she backtracks. But it should be peaceful, though they should still admit their wrongdoings. Feng Yingchen, born 1925. I hate the Japanese even now and want to fight them. I don't want to forgive them. I want to fight the Japanese. Cui Lagi, born 1923. I'm still terrified to meet Japanese people. I will note here that despite the antipathy in many interviews, other interviewees did express forgiveness towards Japanese people who apologized directly to them. In Japan, the Nanjing Massacre is remembered differently than in China. Although most Japanese people do believe the massacre happened, popular school textbooks cover it only briefly and factually, without mention of specific atrocities. Among right-wing nationalists in Japan, even recognition of the massacre is controversial. It is a barrier to their ideals for modern-day Japanese economic and cultural power. In contrast, Chinese students are more likely to learn about the details and be stirred to emotions of grief and indignation. For them, the massacre is taught as the culmination of a century of humiliation that must never be forgotten or repeated. Watching the interviews, I was struck by how some of them are mediated by family members who sit next to the interviewers or linger just off frame. In a way, it is touching. They don't want to leave their parents and grandparents alone. But they also cajole and correct the elderly people when they perceive that a memory could be misinterpreted or is, in their opinion, plain wrong. In Trey Lan Yi's interview, many family members are present. Trey Lan Yi says, "Thanks to the Communist Party, long live Chairman Mao." Her sister, "The best time I can remember is when Mao brought us liberation. I like Chairman Mao and the Communist Party." Her daughter, "Hearing the stories of my aunt and mom, we cultivate our personalities around them to not fear the strong, not bully the weak, and love the country. We hope the party can arrange things for my mother. I appreciate the Communist Party." Other survivors or their family members deliberately express their support for the party. These to me are intriguing statements when the fact was that between the 1950s and 1960s, when the survivors were going through adulthood, Mao Zedong was responsible for the largest famine in human history, in which an estimated 30 million Chinese people starved to death, and triggered the Cultural Revolution, in which some 1.5 million people were killed by programs of state terror. In that, the survivors of the Nanjing Massacre today are triple survivors, enduring not only the Japanese invasion, but the domestic turmoil in the years that followed. My grandmother, who grew up an hour from Nanjing, is such a survivor. When she was 7 years old, her birth parents were compelled by poverty and famine to give her away to another family. During the Cultural Revolution, my grandmother's adoptive family was stripped of their livelihood. Today, no doubt the Chinese government has brought the country to greater economic prosperity compared to the 1940s, And no doubt many Chinese people's lives are indeed better than before. I do not judge what they believe, and I do not question the brutality of the massacre and the lasting trauma inflicted on survivors. But I believe that the afterlife of the Nanjing Massacre is not straightforward, and that even trauma can be weaponized. The word genocide is often understood as a binary between victim and perpetrator. The reality is more complicated. Yes, there are victims, and there are perpetrators indeed, but complicated are the roles that each person plays over a lifetime. Instead of simple narratives, I believe we should work towards complexity and come to terms with all the texture and material that make up our human experience. I want to take a moment to think about imprecise memory. These imprecise, fuzzy memories are not talking points absorbed from power and culture. These memories are the ones on the tip of your tongue, circling in your brain, where articulation fails and experience lives. You are not repeating a story that you know, or that you've heard, or that you've adapted to a narrative form. You are reliving your experience. I was very affected by the memories of Sun Ying-chun, born 1925, one of the older women interviewed. Like many elderly people, the sheer amount of experience in her life makes linear recollection difficult. To me, her testimony reads like a poem. She speaks, circled back on herself, repeats the same thing over and over, and the repetition gives momentum to her memory. This pattern is true of many of the testimonies I listened to. I will read her transcript here exactly as I recorded it. I was 12 years old. The Japanese went across the river to the countryside where we lived, chasing us. They chased us. My sisters and I were chased by the Japanese. We ran towards the countryside. We were scared and ran and hid in the wheat field. The Japanese chased us to the wheat field. We hid in the wheat field, scared, ran together, hid in the wheat field, in the wheat field, in the wheat field. They still chased us. We kept running crazily. We didn't know where we should go, we just kept running. They kept chasing us and we had no place to go. We went to a pond and hid there. We hid in the wheat field. We had no choice but to hide in the wheat field. At that time, we saw a woman. The Japanese saw that woman and stopped chasing us and chased her instead. We kept running to the wheat field. If they didn't see that woman, if they didn't see her, they would chase us. They saw that woman and chased her and left us behind. The Japanese stopped chasing us and we kept running in the wheat field and hid there. We were very young, only 12 years old. If the Japanese wanted to chase us, we would jump into ditches. We were about to jump into a ditch because we had no place to go. When we were about to jump, the Japanese met and saw that woman and chased her instead. We ran through the wheat field, 3 of us. We were little girls, only 12 years old. What should we do? We had no place to go. We were about to die. We made a pact. We held each other's hands and were about to jump into the pond. A woman. They saw that woman and chased her and let us run away. We held hands together and decided to go across the river. We went across the river and ran away. If they didn't see that woman, we couldn't manage to run away. We couldn't escape, we 3 little girls. The villagers thought we died. We jumped into the ditch. How to describe that? We held each other's hands. We floated in the ditch and floated to the opposite bank. We hid in the wheat field and lay on the ground. We went home at night. Our families were crying because they thought we had died. When we didn't die, they were happy. We went home. We were very poor. In the wheat field, we lay on the ground and didn't dare stand up. My father dug a round hole and put us in the hole together. We covered our heads with a board. The Japanese walked on the board and it made a loud noise. They found it was empty below. They felt it was strange and poked at the board with their knives. They poked and found us. They told us to come out and follow their demands. They asked what they should do with us. We, 3 of us, were ready and ran towards the pond. We ran towards the ditch. We went into the ditch together. The Japanese didn't dare swim. We ran towards the ditch. We jumped in the ditch. We jumped in the ditch and went across the water. They didn't dare. The Japanese didn't dare go across the ditch. After that, we ran towards the wheat field and kept running. We ran towards the wheat field. When it became dark, we went home. Our family thought we were dead, thought we jumped into the ditch and drowned. We 3 girls held each other's hands. You hold my hand, I hold your hand. The girls floated on the water, kept floating to the riverbank. We went home that night. Our families were crying and thought we were dead and couldn't be expected to come back. I said we were in the wheat field, hid in the wheat field and survived. We went home. Yes, he chased us and we ran as fast as we could to the wheat field. I was terrified at that time, same as now in my dreams. I was scared to death. They chased us and we kept running. I thought we were about to die. We were about to jump into the pond and kill ourselves, the 3 of us. After we jumped, we were floating in the water. We grabbed each other and floated in the ditch. The Japanese stood on the bank and laughed, We floated on the water, 3 of us, 3 young girls. They laughed on the bank and we held each other in the ditch and floated. The mention of the other woman, the ghost woman, whose presence created the conditions for the 3 girls to escape, continues to haunt me. The motif of the ditch is interesting too, and something I want to think about more. In my grandmother's stories, she also mentioned the ditch, and it seems to me like a banal but terrifying symbol of wartime. My role as an artist is not to historicize only, but to work with materials. The initial goal of this talk was to talk about my animation and anthropology practice. But as I started writing, I did get carried away. I'm still working with the material and gathering thoughts. Animation based on empathy and craft can be an antidote to the binary of good and evil. When I animate, I usually do it by hand. I draw each frame, and 12 frames add up to 1 second of animation. When those frames are shown together quickly, they begin to move. It's really magical. When I'm animating, I'm not outside of the event, but within it. My goal with the texture of drawing and with each frame that seeks to replicate life is to foreground the imprecision of memory and storytelling. I'll show 2 films to show what I mean. The first film is a short work in progress about the practice of foot binding in China in the same period as the Nanjing Massacre or just after, and demonstrates my work process. The second is a film, not by me, about the atomic bombing of Hiroshima. It is not about the Nanjing Massacre, except that it illustrates how the victims of genocide and war are normal people and human relationships of love and empathy. When watching this film, I think about interrelated consequences. The brutal actions of Japanese soldiers abroad compelled decision makers in the United States military to believe that detonating the atomic bomb was a necessity, that burning hundreds and thousands of Japanese people alive was somehow a moral necessity. And moreover, that testing those atomic bombs on the homeland of innocent people in the Pacific Islands was also somehow a moral necessity. I wonder what it means that the film Oppenheimer won the Oscar this year. It is a film that lovingly narrates the flawed genius of the man who invented the atomic bomb, while paging briefly through its impact. It is another project of heritage building, of an American nation building, as potent as the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall. I'm not saying that movies like Oppenheimer should never be made. I'm saying that we should look at the alternatives too. 我的奶奶告诉我，她村里所有的女人都裹着小脚。裹小脚的小女孩不能跑，不能玩。嫁走后，他们生儿女，劳动，做饭、织布、洗衣。我奶奶说，那时候女人没有文化。她看着姐姐的脚被绑，丫头哭个不停。人们告诉她，为了看起来像从古诗中走出来的美女一样优雅，这是值得的。后来，姐姐嫁给了一位在文革中陷入困境的农民，她的小脚对她没有任何好处。The next film is the one that I already explained a little bit about. I think just a really cool film that uses testimony, real testimony from a survivor of the atomic bombing in Japan. And it actually inspired me as I was applying for the fellowship last summer of using testimony in animation. You could just show it as a cool example. Thank you for listening to the talk and for watching that with me. I know it's tough, but I hope people get to enjoy the sunshine later today. I think after seeing that, I think I'm thinking about, it might seem a little bit unusual or contradictory to show at the end of my talk a film about a Japanese person's testimony, but I think it is necessary to show these testimonies next to each other and these forms of media next to each other, because you really see how they're interrelated logically in this film. You know, they make a lot of references to the militarism of the Japanese army and the government at that time, and how it affects people. But I think on an emotional level, hopefully you feel how interconnected they are, that no testimony stands alone, that they all exist together. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Faye. I'm just going to stop the sharing. And before I open it up to the Q&A, which I hope we'll have a lively discussion, I just wanted to mention that Faye was the 2023 Beth and Arthur Lev Research Fellow at the Center, and that's a fellowship that's dedicated for USC students to conduct research with testimonies of the Visual History Archive and other related resources at USC. So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge and thank Beth and Arthur Lev, who funded the fellowship that Faye and many other students have benefited from, and to mention that the deadline for this summer's fellowship competition is in a few days on March 31st. So if you're feeling particularly inspired, you can visit our website and check that out. So now I'm going to open it up for the Q&A, and for those of you in the room, obviously, and on Zoom, just a reminder to use the Q&A feature, and Maya will be asking questions for you in the Zoom. Just get rid of the computer. Do you mind calling on people yourself, Faye? When they raise their hands, you can still stand here, but.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring way to work with testimony and think about using the testimony. A question I had is kind of for that draft that you were showing with the binding of defeat, that video, and I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit more about your decision process making of what media you use, because you go between sort of more of a charcoal to the collage, and so I was wondering, how you think about that in relation to the testimonies you're listening to.
That's a good question. Honestly, at the beginning, that animation, I've done animation and drawing before, but not so many materials. And I actually took a class last semester where we worked with a different material every week. So I already had the story in mind. So every week I was like, okay, how can I make this material fit into the story? So at first it came together a little bit, I guess serendipitously, like randomly. But by the end, I was focusing more on a technique that I really like working with, which is collage photographs with charcoal. I think that most of the photographs that I made the collage out of are like real photographs from that I've taken or from my family. And I think that to me adds a layer of meaning to it. And using the charcoal, I like how the two materials can interact with each other. So for animating, for example, you can have the charcoal completely cover the collage, or have the collage cover the charcoal. You can just, like, anything you can imagine, you can do with it. So I guess the choice now is like looking at how materials interact. At the beginning, it was more like I'm just gonna like try everything.
So thank you, Faye. That was a fascinating presentation, and also your work is fascinating, and I'm deliberately separating these two because this is a comment, I guess, a reaction to your closing of your presentation, that it's amazing that you showed us also Japanese victimhood after talking about the Nanjing Massacre, and I think that's just also food for thought to think about the complexities of victimhood and how even today we are in a world of competing victimhoods, and how with your presentation I think you could show a way to like let go of these walls, let go of these frameworks of only thinking in black and white, because it's so much more complex than that. So that was fascinating. Thank you. And I have a question about the hatred and revenge. I feel that's another taboo topic in histories of violence, and I found that amazing that you emphasize that. And I'm curious what the video testimonies, how and what exactly they were elaborating on. If you could tell us that.
I think in the testimonies that I watched, I haven't seen all of them. There's 102 of them. I watched a bunch of them, but there's still more to watch. The ones that I watched, a lot of it is on the first level. Like I think there's maybe like 3 levels to this. On the first level, I find it understandable that after what these survivors have experienced, they can't forget or can't forgive, even though there's a portion of them that do. I think it just depends on the person. I think with the elderly people, as far as I know, they're not the elderly testimony, like the interviewees, they're not politically powerful or wealthy or anything. So they're just expressing what they feel. And I think in a lot of cases it has been influenced by Chinese media through the years, or, like culture, or how the massacre is taught. And I think it is influenced by that. So I think it is genuine, but it can be mediated. At least that's my conjecture. I don't know exactly how they would frame it, and maybe it's not that. I think where I saw clear mediation was when in some of the interviews, there were family members present. And I wonder if it's like a Chinese culture thing. Like, I think in a lot of the Nanjing interviews, like more so than maybe the other parts of the collection, you would have like your nieces and nephews, children, like grandchildren, like, they would be there too, or they would be interviewed. So, I think it is more family oriented in that. And the family members would, I think there's one, I can't remember exactly who it was, but the person who was being interviewed, the survivor, would say something, and then I think his son would like jump in and be like, no, this is like what you mean. So whether that's because of maybe like ageism, in that they don't trust the elderly person to know what they're saying, or if that is trying to make their testimony more appealing and public facing, because they are it's like partnered with the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Hall, so it is a government partnership in that way. And there's an economics factor as well. I'm not saying people are giving their testimonies for economic reasons, but they do seek, they as they should, they seek help from the government for some of them need to repair their home or need like help with living. So I think there's like maybe your personal feelings and then a more public facing side. Yeah.
So I really appreciated your presentation, and also how you highlighted, or I guess by the nature of the post that you chose, how mixed media art can highlight the lingering impacts of trauma within the imagination that can be captured through photography, or even sometimes in writing. I'm curious about your choice to explore at some points still shots, still frames or comics versus stop motion animation, and like when you choose to use which medium to capture the story that or enhance, I guess, the spirit of the story. And then also, I noticed that your comic was in English, and do you have plans for making it bilingual, or like putting it on some sort of accessible website? And then my other question was, you do a really beautiful job of capturing the rhythm of the storytelling of the narrator in the first piece that you shared. And I know a lot of editors of oral history will kind of take a lot of that repetition out, but you purposefully left it in. And what was your decision?
The first question was about comics versus animation in the language. I think, to be honest, in that it's also kind of a random process. I'll like have or be introduced to a story or have an idea, and then be working on that medium at that time. So when I made the comic, I hadn't learned that much about animation, or I hadn't taken that class I was talking about yet. So I was just doing comics, and then I took that class with animation, and then like, wow, I can make things move, and that's really cool. But I think your question about the differences between the mediums is a really good one, because there are real differences, and you know, of like accessibility, like you can distribute comics really easily, but animation can be a little bit harder in a lot of cases. Yeah, so I think for me it's an intuitive process, but it also depends on the story and whether it feels like a story in motion or a story told through images. And I think it's just honestly like an intuitive thing. For language, yeah, I think that's a great idea. Actually, for the animation, I had English narration at first, but then I felt it wasn't right, so I changed to Chinese. But I think having those options is necessary. And your second question was about oh, the repetition. Yeah, I thought it was, for her testimony, I thought for me it showed like how clearly like she's circling through these events in her head. She's not telling you a story, you know, they're circling in her head and she's living through scenes over and over. And I just felt like that was true to how I heard it. And I debated between putting the actual interview up there or speaking it myself, but I wanted to narrate it because it's also my interpretation of it, you know, like my experience of her experience. And that's what I presented, maybe not exactly her experience, but filtered through what I heard.
Picking up on this, I was also very intrigued with your reading. And can you just clarify? So, did you somehow curate the text, or is it the plain text from the interview? And I found it very kind of corresponding to the fuzziness of the drawings and also the repetition of the drawing. It's also certain in a way. And I thought it goes well with what you mentioned as the fuzzy memory. The drawings are also this kind of fuzzy.
Yeah. So the transcript of the text isn't the transcript from the video, but my transcript of it. And I tried to like write it down exactly as I was listening to it. And yeah, about the fuzziness of the drawing, I really like that about charcoal. Like you can, the process of doing it, people are familiar with animation, you can, it's all on one page, and you just like erase over it and redraw over it. And I like working like that.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is kind of a little bit tied to wolves, but I was wondering, how do you select what sections of the testimony you want to animate? And then something that stood up with me with the fussiness too was that you would always come back to the holding hands. So I was wondering, how do you also select then what to emphasize in those testimonies that you're animating? Thank you again so much.
Yeah, thank you for being here. For that testimony, I think the decisions were based on the repetition that I saw in it, and like I think about like motifs a lot, like the motifs or these ideas that become symbols to me, like the ditch holding hands, the wheat field and running. And for some reason, those motifs like pop up in like my grandparents, like when they're writing things, like these same things pop up over and over. I don't know why, but for that one, I just thought about these motifs and animated them in a cycle. I would like to work with that testimony more, so maybe it would expand more to more like expository narrative scenes. But for the presentation, that was my decision making. Yeah. I think there was a question about her testimony. It does go on. There's more of it, so it's on the Visual History Archive. So that's like maybe half of it or something. Yeah.
I would like to hear more about how you think through your process of listening, because I know this thing was mentioned about
you transcribe the text on your own, and then the way that you are noticing repetition, and then how that becomes part of how you translate it and you're making your ending. Can you talk through it? I know you mentioned it too, that there was that facet to it, but I don't know, can you walk us through your listening practice?
I guess literally how I did it was well, I tried to organize the testimonies. I think I'm going through this like very literally, like in the summer of 2023. You can organize in the archives. You can organize them by a lot of different factors, and I think you have to, otherwise it gets a little overwhelming. Or I guess you can listen to them randomly. Maybe that comes up with something too. So I decided to only listen to women's testimonies, not because I didn't want to listen to the men's testimonies, but because I think in my family, like it's more tied to like women in my family that they have had those experiences. So I decided to do that, and I think I chose it based on women's testimonies because there's like a difference in experience between women and men. And again, I think I need to go through the entire archive, but the women, for example, often like had no education or didn't know how to read, or more often didn't know how to write. So I wanted to hear what that created, like what came out of that. So I would like organize it, and I did it like a variety of ways. I would listen to the oldest, the women who were the oldest first, and then listen to younger women and kind of go back and forth. And then for transcribing, I would watch it through, and the Chinese testimonies do have subtitles, so I had those to help, but I try to listen to the Chinese because sometimes they don't match, or the meaning is right, but you know the translation depends on your interpretation. So I would have the transcript and then try to transcribe it and just write it all down basically. And then later I would go through and like try to pick out themes. And then I guess somehow it like becomes ideas for animation. That, you know, like that process is like very, you know, it just happens. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering that when you're making these decisions to create a visual version of an oral testimony, in what ways do you view your work as creating or modifying historical records that exist already, or what you're trying to create? If you also like to comment on what you think about state when you're doing your work.
So modifying records, I think
yeah, or like how you like intersect and modify your work with the historical record.
yeah, I think your question makes me think of like I definitely am modifying the historical record. Like it's not like the interview itself is the media that is like the truest. I don't know, but like, you know, it's like if you could just watch the interview and it would be exactly from the interviewee's thoughts and at that time. So I think I want to say I am modifying it in a way. I don't know where I'm going with this answer. And your next part was about how the historical record modifies my work, or how those intersect. Yeah. I think it definitely does. Without these testimonies, my work would not exist. You know, so they are the most important thing to me. And a lot of my work is about these historical testimonies and records, so they are the most important thing. Yeah, my work would not be possible without them, and for that I am very grateful. I feel like maybe I play a secondary role in that I'm taking things from this work, but I'm, you know, I think translating it and Mike in the talk, being able to reconfigure things and put them next to each other or have them speak to each other, I think is what I hope to add.
Well, first off, thank you so much. And this kind of goes back to her comment in the sense that I also really appreciate that you were just very frank and honest with like the vengefulness and the anger that a lot of these testimonies come with. And I also want to say that as someone of like Japanese and Okinawan descent, because I feel as if like that taboo like has to be heard, and I just really appreciate you being like very shamelessly open about that. And on that note, I come less as like an artist, more so as someone in like history and East Asian area studies. But I was just wondering in these testimonies whether there was any expression of like, or if those who offered testimonies were ever kind of asked like what is something that you want for the survivor community? I know nothing can ever offer closure, but what would the sort of like the grieving of the mourning and the progress look like, and what kind of accountability would you like to see for perpetrators or their descendants like now in Japan? Because I also feel like as someone who kind of holds that identity, this is something that I think needs to be shared. I also kind of wonder if, and I know this is still like there are so many walls and barriers to like sharing the story in Japan, but I've always wondered like have you ever considered an avenue to kind of share these narratives to like a Japanese facing audience? Mm-hmm. You know, maybe that's still like a really thick wall there, but I was just wondering because I really think that there's a ton of value to what you do. And I was just wondering where you're at with this.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that question. I think that's a really big, complicated question. Something that comes to mind is that I want to recognize that in all of the scholarly articles that I've read, it does say that most Japanese people do recognize that the massacre happened. Like, it's a small proportion of right-wing nationalist people who just flat out deny it. One interesting scholar that I read, though, talked about the difference between factual memory and emotional memory. And I think from the testimonies so factual memory is, knowing the facts of what happened, which is maybe what a lot of textbooks in Japan just, they list out the facts. And American textbook too, when they talk about the atomic bomb, they're like, this happened and that's it. And it doesn't allow you to access the emotion and the real impact of it. But in China, I think a lot of the discourse is on the other side, way on the other side, where it is so emotional and so potent and just has become part of the national identity. Not always, but now it has been like stirred up to that point. And I think what I heard in a lot of the testimonies, and again, it's different from person to person, but what I heard about it is that a lot of them want Japanese people to apologize, and visitors to the Memorial Hall and scholars and have recognized the massacre and apologized directly to the victims. But I think maybe what they feel is that they want more of an emotional recognition. But I don't know. Like I think the politics between Japan and China makes that very difficult. And the different experiences of people's history make that very difficult. But I feel like that is what they seek, and maybe it is impossible. On a very practical level for reparations, I think even the history of the Nanjing Massacre, as I mentioned before, in China is complicated. And I think I need to do more research on this, but as far as I'm aware, there are reparations available from the Chinese government. I don't know how much, or it's something that I need to research more. But I think on a very practical level, that is also what they seek. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm gonna be jumping off a couple things because I have like some comments and questions. But I just wanted to bounce off of what you said most recently because I thought it was really interesting talking about like what the my mom like made sure that I knew about Hiroshima growing up, and like she had me there again and all that. So I remember like that feeling of like the humiliation that you mentioned from those years is something that my mom also like, when it came to Hiroshima, like she very much made sure I knew that. So that's less of a question, more of a comment, like what those things and talking about you, I really appreciate seeing both of these films side by side. I just wanted to start with a couple of comments from the Zoom chat. Darren Eller, an archivist at the Shoah Foundation, said, "Thank you for the presentation. You seem to have found the poetry in a traumatic event. It helps the listener move beyond the literal to the deeper trauma of the situation that she describes." Adriana Reynoso, also an indexer with the Shoah Foundation, said, "I'm Darren, thank you for this presentation." And Ani Harbulian, from Marshall School of Business, also just wanted to say thank you so much for your presentation. It's such a unique way of looking at such a traumatic event. I learned so much today. So those are some of the comments. And Lynn Wolf, who is a German studies professor at Michigan State University, also said, "Thank you for sharing your work. I would be interested in hearing about your artistic influences. The stop motion animation reminds me of William Partridge, as well as and this actually kind of ties into what you were just talking about, as well as if you think about an audience, like your audience. You talked about being within the event while animating, but are you also thinking about others engaging with your work and the testimonies after your work is finished?" That's a lot. So if I repeat anything.
The first part was about influences, and the second part was about audience.
Yes.
I think for the first part, Kentridge is definitely a big influence in charcoal animation and local work in general. So I look at his work. I think I just like maybe grab things from a lot of different places. I'm not good at remembering exact names, but I like a lot of people who, and I can, if anyone's interested, I can like compile a list of animators later. But I like people who work with real material. Not saying digital is not a real material, but I like working with materials that you can put your hands on. Trying to think of some names. Carolyn Leaf is someone. She worked a lot with sand animation. Really beautiful use of like sand and light. Yeah, a bunch of people, and like names are blanking out of my head right now, but I will make a list for anyone who wants references. The second question is about audience. And I think that's an interesting question that I think people ask artists a lot, and there are some people from my program right now, my colleagues who are also artists, so maybe you all know about this, that people ask, okay, like who's your audience? Who are you speaking to? And I feel like I never know what to say, because I'm like, okay, people at a university watching a film, but I don't want that to only be my audience. And I think if a work is effective enough and gives enough, it can go beyond that. And I think I've come to the conclusion that based on conversations with other people and inspiration from other people, that you would hope that your work creates the audience, which is like maybe an egoistical thing to say, but I truly believe that an audience does not exist. Your work happens and then people come to it, whether randomly, like maybe people see a random flyer or they click on a link on YouTube. You create the work and then the audience happens. And I think that's easier because you don't have to think about the audience.
I just want to make more comment because earlier we talked about modifying historical records. I think art and your work has the capacity not to modify, but to eliminate historical records in a different way, which historians would not have access to. So, for example, when I would put myself in your shoes watching this video as a historian, I would probably be annoyed about inserting memory, right? Because it doesn't really help me. to understand the process, but what you did with it illuminated the pain of the memory in a way which I would not think as a historian, but I just watched the video. So this was really
Yeah, and kind of to bounce off of that, and kind of this idea of like the circularity of memory, considering the piece where you kind of did a little spoken word performance on, as well as the Hiroshima piece, and kind of this theme in the opening scene of like nightmares and kind of reliving that past. I was wondering whether at any point you ever thought about how like non-linear time, or kind of like the ways we kind of process time in a loop, especially if there's something that was really traumatic happened to us. Obviously, this is not something maybe we as historians always think about, because we think of time on the line sometimes. But I was just wondering whether this was on your mind at any point during this process.
Yeah, I think so, definitely, especially when I don't know if on like a human life scale we actually live in a circular way, but we certainly remember things, and our identities and everything about us is formed in a circular way, and that impacts how we live. So yeah, definitely, I think. Yeah. And I think it's interesting, like the contrast between what you two are talking about the approaches to historians, academic historians doing history. And I wonder if there are any experiments in that field where people do look at things in a nonlinear way. I think would be my question for you.
I just wanted to say it's a very Derrida kind of postmodernist deconstructing historical narrative. It's definitely happening in the field of history, but so far I think it's mainly in histories of violence. That's what I know about. My study is particularly Holocaust history. It has been brought up, and it's more about the ethics of representation of violence and pain. But I think on a more practical level, historians are using it in Black feminist studies and more specifically in the history of slavery. And they have amazing, tremendous findings there where they leave the linear behind and they deconstruct basically this chronological depiction.
Thank you.
Oh, I just wanted to say that I was interested in the movement of the older woman in the Hiroshima film, the way that she kind of followed, and the way the movement of the women who had their feet down. I was just like struck by the symmetry and the way that movement. It's not really a question. It's just a
Yeah, I think that's a really good comment, because it's not just the narration, but it's the echoing of gestures and movements and textures that brings that circularity back to. Yeah.
Well, if audiences truly find art, then this audience is very grateful to you, Faye, for your talk. Thank you so much. And our next event is in 1 week from today, and it's on the research by Alex Sabo, who's here in the audience, who made some very insightful comments. Her research on sterilization and castration abuse of survivors from Nazi camps and victims in Nazi camps, and how they cope with those memories. So please join us, same time next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.